I want to see it be much easier to invest directly in local businesses in developing countries. I was like, maybe there's something that can be learned from China. What were the policies that they were using to create these really rapid reductions in poverty levels that might be somewhat applicable to other parts of the world?
I have so many questions for you.
Okay.
I know that financial inclusion has been something that you've been working on for a really long time. I'm curious, like, what sparked that? Like, when did that become something that you were so passionate about?
I studied abroad in Brazil when I was in college, and I was writing my thesis on the storytelling tradition of a community of artisan fishermen who practice this very sort of traditional fishing method. They're line fishermen, and they use boats that they built themselves out of wood, and the fabrics, the sail is fabric of whatever kind of fabric they could find, and they live in this community that's very everybody get comfortable.
Everybody get comfortable. Yeah.
So I got very, very interested in the formal and informal economy concept while I was working with them. I was recording their stories and trying to understand their lives and their storytelling tradition, which they claimed didn't exist anymore. They were like, we don't tell stories. And then they would tell them when I was recording them and try to figure out why you would say you don't tell stories. And it was this very traditional community, but the city had grown up around it, actually. And I was sort of trying to figure out how could they still be there, because there's a commercial fishing industry right next to them. And it turned out that the commercial fishing industry there was developed with a lot of subsidies, so it was very inefficient. And when fuel prices went above a certain level, those boats wouldn't even go out to sea. Yeah. And this is a pretty big city with a large appetite for seafood. And so during those time periods, these fishermen would basically supply the city's entire seafood needs. And that was kind of what kept them there as this sort of cohesive unit. They were a cooperative, and they lived in a neighborhood nearby. And I deeply loved getting to know them and spending time with them and hearing their stories and understanding how they wanted to preserve their community identity, but also felt very marginalized by the city and were upset that their kids were dropping out of school to become fishermen, and there was a really large sex tourism trade there at the time as well. So that's what a lot of the daughters were getting involved in, and the more I spent time with them and in their homes and eating dinner with them and things like that, just it was I got to feel very, very close to them and very profoundly angry at the fact that they had no economic security. And the fisheries were starting to get depleted, and there were some times that they were coming back after a whole day of fishing with almost nothing, and that was the only source of income for their families. And just seeing how little economic security they had, I got very interested in, how could you have a formal fish market and then the informal one, and all of these things happening side by side, and what would it take to extend the formal to the informal, or get the informal into the formal, and I think the thing that I realized is that the cost of capital, especially access to credit for all sorts of things like growing a business, but also financing an education, buying a vehicle, owning a home, things like that credit was just really, really critical. And the interest rates there were extremely high. When you couldn't find an interest rate like that in a developed economy. And so I started studying, what is it? Where does capital come from? What is the cycle of it all the way down to somebody who wants access to credit in a loan size of maybe a few $100s, and what do they have to do to get it? And so I think it was really spending time with that community that sort of lit a fire under me to try to fix it.
And how long were you with that community?
About 6 months.
Amazing. And what brought you there in the first place? Why do that project, and why Brazil?
I was really interested in Brazil because actually I think it was the mix of different cultures. I've always been very interested in the concept of culture. I love languages.
How many languages do you speak?
5.
Just 5 languages.
And I downloaded like every language on Duolingo as well, so I'm like gradually learning individual words of like Turkish. I was in a bakery a few days ago and I saw that there was a bread called ekmek, and I was like, that just means bread in Turkish. And you're like, whoa. it's a really fun app. Anyway, what were we talking about?
What brought you?
Yeah, how did I go to Brazil?
Bread, so, I think is what we were talking about.
Yeah, I think it was, I was very interested in the African and indigenous and European influence there. And I loved Brazilian music and wanted to learn Portuguese and thought it would be really interesting. And I think the African influence there because of the slave trade, and I'm originally from Charleston, South Carolina, which was a major slave port in the United States, and seeing the West African influence in Charleston and the Gullah communities that live along the sea islands there that had been very isolated for a long time and really didn't have access to a lot of the basic services and education and things like that, even though they were part of the United States, but had been so isolated. That really drew me to what were the historical migration patterns, and where are there really traditional cultures that are also intersecting with really fast economic development.
Yeah,
so
very cool.
That was where it came from.
Awesome. So you finished your time in Brazil, then what happened?
I went back to university. I was there for my senior year. My now husband, who was my next door neighbor at the time, he was actually my next door neighbor and my ex-boyfriend at the time. It was really complicated. And my best friend was on the other side of me, and her ex was on the other side of her, and we were like, we're in an ex-boyfriend sandwich. How did this happen? And I walked into my room that day and I was like, why is there a door in the wall? And there was literally a door in the wall between our two rooms. I think it had been like for some person and their butler or something, that there were like two adjoined rooms. Anyway, so I shared, and there was plywood over it, and we ended up taking the plywood down, and we were like, we have 2-bedroom suite, whatever. And then we were not exes anymore, so.
That's usually how it works, you move the plywood.
Right. We were like, we could put it sideways and make it a beer pong table between the two rooms. Anyway. So he moved to China when he graduated, because he was a year older than I was, and I was really interested in trying to figure out how do you, this formal and informal economy thing, how do you create policies that could fix that? Because I was really focused on economic security, and it seemed like this community had been so isolated. How could the government have created more of a safety net for them? And so he moved to China, and I was kind of interested in learning Mandarin. Learning a non-Romance language seemed like it would be really hard and fun. And I don't know that I would describe it that way in retrospect.
You're exposing your nerd just a little bit. That's okay. That's welcome.
And so I was like, maybe there's something that can be learned from China, having this, largest internal human migration in history, the special economic zones that they'd created. Like, what were the policies that they were using to create these really rapid reductions in poverty levels that might be somewhat applicable to other parts of the world, even if the demographic situation was pretty unique in China. So I used that as a justification for not looking at it for a job for my whole senior year, and then being like, I guess I also have to move to China. So I did, and I started working for a French microfinance NGO that literally happened to be in the building next door to mine, and they advertised an internship for a native Mandarin speaker, and I was like, I've taken 2 days of Mandarin, but I live next door. And they were like, oh, that's pretty convenient. So I was like, great. And I did a little volunteering at a school for migrant children, and at a health clinic for Tibetans. And so I was kind of exploring little like health, education, financial services, and I felt like the cost of capital was something that seemed so fundamental to everything else and affected other things. Not that all three of those aren't intertwined, but that was really what sort of grabbed me and lit a fire under me. And then they offered me a job in Madagascar. And my husband had previously given up a Peace Corps position there, because I had been like, we're never going to see each other again if you go to Madagascar. And so we were like, what a weird coincidence. Madagascar comes up again. So we went. And then there was a coup, and then we moved a lot of times.
This is like 7 fireside chats in 11. Sorry. I don't even know where to go next. So what I'm hearing is that you were interested in policy as a solution to some of these issues of bringing formal and informal. So I'm curious what switched, or maybe hasn't switched, but from policy to entrepreneurship.
I think trying to work in policy made me want to work in markets. I was like, wait, this is not going to happen quickly, and like a 22-year-old's not going to get anything done. But I think it's really the intersection of policy and markets where these things happen. And I later went to grad school and sort of studied both and studied the intersection of them. And I think, there's a lot of really well-defined evidence for which kinds of policies are help create this kind of progress. And there's been a lot of interesting experimentation with them across a bunch of countries, including in the United States. And so I think it has become more apparent that that's critical, but it feels like a bit of a log jam sometimes to get those things done. And ultimately, I think, for what we are doing, this is a private sector solution that is very much based on kind of asymmetrical information. And if you can fix the information gap, then essentially you can make capital flow at a lower cost from one entity to the next, and that shouldn't necessarily require policy, but we do get pretty involved in consumer protection policy and trying to make a case for the things that we believe in, like people owning their own data and what should be done to keep it secure and things like that.
Awesome. When did you decide to take it into your own hands and start First Access?
I met my co-founder in the first week that I moved to New York. I went to the Microfinance Club of New York for a debate on whether there should be interest rate caps in microfinance or something like that, which is irrelevant because there's no global body that could create caps across all countries, but it was basically, should there be a global cap? And it was like the first time I've ever been early to anything, pretty much. And I met this man there, and we started talking, and we kept in touch, and he was an expert networker. And I remember by the time I'd gotten home, he'd sent me scanned photos of all of the business cards from the people that he met at that event that he thought that I should keep in touch with. And I was like, whoa. And he would hear about all these projects and send me random emails like, what do you think about this sustainable housing project in, Pakistan? And I'd be like, I don't know anything about this, but it seems really interesting. Like, what about, and we would get in these interesting conversations. And one day he sent me an email like, how would you try to use data, and particularly mobile data, to reduce risk in microfinance? And I love statistics, and I had been kind of getting back into math after trying to avoid it for many years. And I was like, wow, I actually know something about that. And I had just been working for this microfinance organization in all these different countries with loan officers, and seeing this really arduous process that they go through to go to someone's home and business and do a whole evaluation of the person's cash flows and risk level to decide whether they can get, a $400 or $500 loan. And so I was like, if I could get some historical data from a microfinance institution on how people performed on credit, and then get those same people's mobile data, you could link it together, you could build a statistical model, you could prove that it works. And ultimately, we found that we didn't need mobile data, which was great, but it was a big kind of breakthrough to figure out, can you create mathematical models that will help predict different people's risk level and allow financial institutions to make faster decisions for the people that they know are lower risk, so that reduces their operating expenses, which are very high. And the next thing we're really trying to tackle is their cost of capital. So can we partner with investors who are putting debt into those financial institutions, and then the financial institutions are lending it to borrowers? Because if we can reduce the cost there as well, then we can reduce interest rates further on the ground.
Amazing. Maybe my final question for you is, when First Access continues to be wildly successful, what does the world look like? How do things change?
I would like to see I specifically will feel like we've started to really chip away at this once we really see interest rates at the institutions that we're working with come down in a sustainable way across multiple loan products. And that obviously requires competition among other institutions too, and we're trying to get as much scale as we can, but I want to see it be much easier to invest directly in local businesses in developing countries, no matter where you are. Not necessarily with peer-to-peer financing, but I think with institutional investors, so that there aren't so many intermediaries, and so that the interest rates that are being charged on the ground are a lot lower, and just more people have access to credit for all sorts of things. So that's the goal.
It's an amazing vision. Thank you so much for sharing that, Nicole.